me okay? Great. So this actually fits in really well with Leonie's presentation because she just spoke about the domestic sphere. I'm going to be talking about the public sphere and IoT technologies in them. So as was mentioned, I'm a PhD researcher at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I'm looking at technologies in public spaces and specifically the factors shaping security throughout the process by which these technologies become integrated. My research is socio-technical, which means I look at the human and social side of these technologies and security. And the message I want to leave you with today is that the way we communicate about these technologies really matters for security. So on the slide is an illustration. Sorry, that's a bit squeaky. Okay, thank you. Is that better? Yeah, great. So on the slide is an illustration that I had commissioned from the artist Teresa Horacek for a presentation I was actually giving to members of the public about my research, but I wanted to use it today because I think it's quite a fun way to look at the different technologies we share our public spaces with. And these technologies are being increasingly integrated into our public spaces. I'm sure you'll recognize some of them on the slide there, as well as in the private sphere. And the reason I'm talking to you today is because many of these technologies are internet connected, and we know, as has been spoken about many times today, that means there's specific risks that are associated with these technologies when we're connecting them to our wider systems. So the types of data collection I do during my research mostly involves talking to people, often through interviews with people involved in the process of integrating these technologies, but also through other, maybe more unusual methods. So I do event observation, so I come to events like the one we're at today, and I listen to how people are communicating about these technologies, how information is shared. And I also do walks. So basically, I walk through public spaces and spot what kinds of technology I can see around that we're sharing our public spaces with, and use that to follow up to get some more information. And this type of method isn't actually new. There's research that's been done out of Lancaster University by Jacobs on this, and there's also something called data walking, which is done by Alison Powell. So on the slide are some images that I took on my walks where I was spotting technologies in public places, and I'm sure you'll recognize many, if not all of these. We've got an electric vehicle charger to the right on the top row, a traffic monitoring sensor, lots of cameras, which could be surveillance cameras or also automatic number plate recognition, as well as air quality sensors, which are a little bit more difficult to spot. And many of these technologies are introduced for efficiency savings, cost savings, so for things like public transport, but also for the environment, so improving air quality, reducing carbon emission, as well as public safety, so that's why we see a lot of surveillance cameras around. And what I'm interested in is the messy process that happens to get these technologies put into our public places. And what I've found in my research is that there are many different organizations involved in this process, all the way from EU level, national level, who are funding these types of technologies being implemented, down to local authority level, who are often responsible for the overall implementation of these technologies, but actually at a community level. So I've seen very small communities come together to implement technologies such as a speed sensor in their local area to reduce speeding. And what is emerging as I analyze this ongoing research is that the practices that people use to integrate these technologies interplay with the narratives in this process to have specific consequences for security. So what do I mean by practices and narratives? Practices is relatively easy to understand. We've spoken about it a lot today. It's the things people do in order to implement these technologies. So, for example, many of these technologies are connected onto lampposts or walls. They're out in the open and they're often monitored remotely. These are practices. When I'm talking about narratives, I'm talking about the way we communicate about these technologies. So the way we structure what we're saying and the language that we use. And looking at narrative in cybersecurity isn't actually new either. It's something that's been done by Genevieve Lively, a professor at the University of Bristol, who's done some really interesting work. I recommend you have a look at it. And the narrative that I'm finding in technologies in public places actually doesn't differ very much from any other technology that we talk about. So it goes something like this. Organizations like suppliers or local authorities are the protagonist or the hero in the story. A narrative is essentially a story. And they sell ideas about a future which is more efficient, more green and safer, and essentially reject ideas of the past, which is seen as less safe, less environmentally friendly and efficient, and mobilize this for revenue. But revenue isn't the only part in this. Also, data is really important, as I'm sure you're aware. So many of these devices collect data, and data becomes an asset in that story. Significantly, they use experimentation to try and get to that outcome. And you might recognize narratives like this when you see, for example, AI being spoken about in the media, because that's being spoken about a lot at the moment. You might also notice in that narrative that people don't come into it very much, or they're often relatively passive. So they have some output in early stages of these technologies being implemented, but they don't really come in much later in the story. So I'm going to give you some examples of how parts of that narrative that I spoke about interplay with the practices that people use to implement these technologies and what that means for security. So I mentioned experimentation there. And what that means is many of these technologies are being implemented on quite a small scale. So a handful of IoT devices are bought, for example, by a local authority and implemented in a closed geographical area. And many of these devices are also really cheap. They're pretty easy to buy. And what that means in terms of security is that we're often seeing short-term projects where very little money is actually involved. And usually when projects like this are being put into place, we have a procurement process where security questions are asked about the technologies that are being bought. But because these technologies are cheap and being put in place on a small scale, that procurement process doesn't actually often kick in. There's a budget at which it kicks in and we ask the security questions, but many of these projects just completely undercut that and skip that, which is really significant for security and something that's been raised to me quite a few times in the interviews I've done. Another example is that I mentioned data is an asset in this. And this is a really interesting one because when people talk about securing data when I speak to them, they're often talking about securing personal data, which is, of course, really important. We have GDPR. It's often liability-driven. But in practice, many of these devices don't actually collect personal data. So what I've found that this means for security is that if the device we're talking about doesn't collect personal data, people often just dismiss security entirely. There's not much liability there to worry about. But actually, we know in terms of security of IoT devices, we're talking about security of systems, security of devices, security of organizations, not just personal data. So it's quite important that we don't dismiss security from the get-go. I also mentioned that organizations are protagonists or heroes in this story, and in practice there are many of them involved. And with organizations seen as the protagonists in the story, they often focus on their own role, and that makes responsibility very difficult and messy throughout the process because there's so many of them. So what we see is it's very difficult to define who's in charge of security, particularly when we're talking about across systems. So when we're talking about integrating IoT devices, we're often integrating them into wider systems, and that's obviously very important for security. And finally, I mentioned that people are absent or relatively passive from this story. And in practice, many of these devices are out in the open. They're not often directly used by people passing by. And what that means in practice is that it's actually really difficult to question and engage with these technologies, even though we share our public spaces with them. So I actually found when I was doing my walks, I obviously spotted many different surveillance cameras around, and you'll see they should have a plaque or a sign next to them that says who manages them and how you can contact them. And that's exactly what I did with many of the cameras I found. I went and I tried to contact the details on there, and it was almost impossible to speak to anyone about it and understand what that camera was there for and if I could do anything with the data it collected on me. And that raises quite significant issues for privacy, but it also raises broader questions about how we're able to engage with the technologies that we're walking past on our everyday. And there's obviously a really interesting case of this with ultra-low emission zones, low emission zones, zero emission zones, where we've seen in the news these types of technologies actually being physically tampered with or even attacked in cases. And this is where some distrust of these technologies is bubbling up, but there isn't necessarily the avenues to be able to engage with or question them designed in the first place. So, as your people involved in IoT, what can you do about these things? And I'm returning to this illustration because it does one thing that the narrative I spoke about doesn't do so well, and that's that it centers people. There are people throughout this picture. And that's really important because if we are able to write people back into that narrative, we can think more about the impacts that it has on them, particularly the unintended impacts, how they can engage with these technologies and what happens in the everyday. And this links back, actually, again to Leonie's presentation when she's talking about some of those unintended consequences that weren't necessarily thought about in the design stage. I'd also like you to think about longevity of technologies and the fact that many of these technologies are being introduced incrementally. There's very rarely entire systems being replaced. We're seeing new technologies being implemented along with old legacy systems, and that's so important for security, as I'm sure you're aware. So when we have this narrative that focuses on a kind of glossy future, that doesn't quite recognize what's happening in practice, and it's important that we do that for security. I'd also like you to think about responsibility. And this is not a particularly fun thing to talk about, so I think that's why it doesn't come into narratives, because narratives are often used in marketing contexts where we want it to be exciting. But responsibility is really important to think about across systems, across organizations, and across processes. And in order to harness the full benefits of these technologies, it's a really important issue to think about. And finally, if we talk specifically about use cases, it's much easier to understand the risks and impacts. I mentioned that the narrative I've noticed throughout my research doesn't differ hugely from narratives in general about technology, and that creates a real issue if we're understanding security in these specific contexts that we're talking about. So we can think a little bit more about what is being secured and why it's being secured beyond just the security of data. So I've given you multiple different ways to change and think about narrative, but I haven't really spoken about practices, even though I said that was half of the equation. But that was a deliberate thing today, because I feel like at conferences like this, we talk about practices a lot, and that's really important, but we actually give very little attention to how we talk and communicate about these technologies, which I'm arguing is half the battle, and a relatively easy fix, I'd say. So maybe next year I can come back and talk about practices when we fix the narratives. So I'm going to leave you to think about what you can do to improve this and get the most out of the technologies that you look after. Thank you very much for listening. It was an absolute pleasure. And if you have any questions, come and find me afterwards, or my email is on the slide. Does anyone have any questions?